Bibles tonight and turn to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, as we've been going through the Gospel of Luke on Sunday nights, and tonight we'll be in Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 41. But as you're turning there, I said next Sunday night we'll not have service since we have a meeting following Sunday morning next Sunday, and then next Sunday night being Super Bowl Sunday. I said this morning, for those excited about the Super Bowl, you can watch that. For those who could care less, you can do something else. Personally, I am so excited about the Super Bowl, I didn't know who was playing until I looked it up last night. So I'm there now. I really thought the Cardinals had a shot this year at the Super Bowl, but I guess they didn't make it. But I am a sports enthusiast, as you know, so I'm pretty excited myself. But Luke chapter 2 tonight, verse 41 says, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. And when they had finished the days as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and his mother did not know it, but supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. So when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. So it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. I don't know if you have ever gone on a trip and you felt like you forgot something. That happens to us all the time. We feel like we forgot something when we've gotten down the road. Sometimes we have. We forgot something and realized as soon as we've gone, man, we forgot that. We wish we'd picked it up, but we just didn't do it. I'm pretty good about keeping a packing list, and every time we are going to go somewhere, I check the list and make sure I've got all of my stuff, but sometimes it still happens you forget something. Can you imagine, though, in this journey, what Joseph and Mary forgot was their son? I will say that out of the things we might have forgotten on trips, we've always remembered our kids. We've not left any of them behind yet. And so here they lose their own child, Jesus, and then find him again at the end of the story. And so I want to talk tonight about the Lord's presence and talk about this event. It's a fascinating event in the life of Jesus because it's the only story we have of his childhood. The only story we have from his birth until his adulthood is this story when we find him in the temple. So I want you to imagine, because it's all surrounding a holiday. And we have just had one holiday, Groundhog Day, when the groundhog said that, I think they said, right, spring is coming. And you know what I said? Well, duh, look outside. It's 60 degrees in February. I didn't need a groundhog to tell me that. We have Valentine's coming up, and then will come St. Patrick's Day and Easter and all these holidays. But if you were living in the time of Jesus, if you were a Jewish boy, I'm telling you, the big calendar, the big holiday on the calendar was Passover. That was what you looked forward to every year. For many of us, it's Christmas is the big one everyone looks forward to. For them, it was Passover, especially if you lived as Jesus did in a little village like Nazareth, many, many miles from Jerusalem, because you very seldom left that village. But this was the one time of the year that any Jewish family that could would make the trip to the city of Jerusalem for Passover. It was an exciting time, and so the year had rolled around again. Jesus is now 12 years old, and it's time to go to Passover. It's springtime, and Mary and Joseph tell Jesus and tell the rest of them, all right, we're going to pack up and we're going to go. From Nazareth to Jerusalem, it's about 65 miles. And this trip was going to take a long time because they were obviously going to be walking. A few people might have a donkey or something, but they're going to stay together. And when they would travel that distance, they would oftentimes go with other people because it was dangerous to travel that far. So many times people from the village would get together and they'd say, hey, are you going to Passover? You going to Jerusalem? Yes, I'm going. We're going. Let's all go together. It might have been dozens. It might have been many dozens of people from Nazareth who said, we're going to make the trip. And so they start packing. Maybe they are like we are, and they have a list and they go through it, check off the stuff. We've got to make sure we have clothes for the journey. Got to make sure we have food. We've got to make sure we have some mats to lay on. Maybe take a tent or two for the trip as we journey down to Jerusalem. And among all the other stuff we have to take the sacrifice that we're going to take for the Passover. And so they finally go that morning and they say, all right, it's time to go. We've got all the stuff. And they set out. As I said, we don't know how many there were. Maybe dozens, maybe many of dozens. But they leave the city of Nazareth and they begin to make their journey all these miles to the city of Jerusalem. I can imagine the excitement, especially among the kids, what it's like to go to the big city of Jerusalem when you live in the little village and only once a year do you get to see the big city of Jerusalem. And they begin to make that journey over the hills and the valleys as they're headed down to Jerusalem. And then finally the day comes that they can see it. Off in the distance, up there on the Mount Zion, they see the city sitting up there. They see the walls that are there. They see the temple because it's overlaid in gold, shining like a diamond in the middle of the desert there, right out there. And they think there's the city of David. That's the city of Solomon where he built the walls and the temple and all of this. They're all excited as they're making their way to Jerusalem. And then they begin to make their way into the city of Jerusalem. One of the gates they would have have come through into the city of Jerusalem. They would have heard the choirs singing. They would have seen all the activity of the hundreds of thousands of people that had poured in for Passover. Everybody walking around with their lamb and their turtle doves and their goats and all the things they're going to take for the sacrifice. And they see all the hustle and bustle of activity as everybody's getting ready for the Passover meal. And they walk in the city of Jerusalem. What must it have been like for Jesus at 12 years old as he walks in this city and he sees certain events that we know he could see further down and know what's going to happen there? What must it have been like when he walked by the pool of Bethesda and thought, you know what, in a few years I'm going to come by here and I'm going to find a lame man and I'm going to say, take up thy mat and thy bed and walk, and he's going to be healed and he's going to walk out of the pool of Bethesda? What must have been like when he walked by the pool of Siloam and he says, you know what, some years from now there's going to be a man come to me born blind, that I'm going to put mud in his eyes and I'm going to say, go wash in the pool of Siloam, and he's going to wash it out. And when they come to him and the critics come and they say, tell us about the man that did this, he's going to say, there's a lot of things I don't know, but one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Jesus would look around the city and he would see the temple courtyards where he would see even then the kiosks and the carts and the things where the money changers were selling sacrifices and charging people interest on all the sacrifices that are going in there. And Jesus thinks, one of these days I'm coming back, not as a 12-year-old, but as an adult, and I'm going to drive the money changers out of here. He would have seen the palace of Herod, and he would have seen the praetorium, the Antonia fortress where the governor would live. And he would think, you know, one of these nights here in the not so distant future, I'm going to be shuttled between Pilate and Herod that night when they're going to mock me and put a purple coat on me, and they're going to put a crown of thorns, and they're going to spit on me, and they're going to call me the king, but not because they believe it, because they're making fun of me. And Pilate's going to say he finds no fault in me. He would have seen somewhere in that city the upper room. Maybe he could see the stairs from the outside going into the upper room, thinking, one of these days I'm coming back here and I'm going to celebrate Passover again, but it's going to be different. It's going to be in that upper room, and I'm going to sit there with my disciples, and after I've washed their feet, I'm going to break the bread and lift up the fruit of the vine, and I'm going to say, this is the blood of my covenant, a new covenant that I give to you, and I'm going to walk out of there and go to the Garden of Gethsemane. He probably would have seen maybe the platform that Pilate would have stood one day with Jesus and Barabbas and told the crowd, make your choice. And they say, give us Barabbas and crucify Jesus. But today he's 12, walking around the city of Jerusalem, seeing all of this stuff that one day is going to be different than it is today. But today he's 12, and he goes with his family as they take the sacrifice, and they take it to the temple, and they watch as that sacrifice is slain and the blood is offered, and then they get together for the Passover meal that night. How exciting that is, as they sit around that night, and the whole thing is focused on a lamb, a roasted lamb. And as they eat that lamb, they're thinking not in the future now, but into the past, as they're thinking of that night in the book of Exodus, all those hundreds and thousands of years ago when Moses was in Egypt. And they sit there that night and they sit around and talk about it as they're having lamb and they're having the bitter herbs and all that goes into the Passover meal. And they're remembering that night. They're remembering the God saying the judgment was going to come on Egypt, and they remember the fear of their ancestors. Then they remember God giving them a promise. You take a lamb and you put the blood of that lamb on the doorposts of your home, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And there they are looking at that lamb sitting on their table. And they say it's because of a lamb. It's because of a little lamb like this that our ancestors were saved, because they took the blood and put it on the doorpost of their home. And God passed over them and delivered them from Egypt, and they walked across the Red Sea. And all because of that lamb, they found deliverance. All because of that lamb, they found freedom. And as they're talking about it, 12-year-old Jesus must have been thinking, one of these days, John the Baptist is going to point and say, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. It wasn't that lamb that brought deliverance and freedom. It's going to be this lamb, the 12-year-old Jesus, who one day is going to be offered as the real sacrifice. And then the Passover is over. You know, I love holidays, but I always hate when the holiday is over. It's always a little bit discouraging when it's over, you know. We love Easter. We get all excited about Good Friday service and our Easter outreach, and Easter Sunday morning is so excited. But can I tell you, there's no church on earth that gets excited about the week after Easter. Nobody gets excited about that. Everybody knows we're not going to have the attendance we had on Easter Sunday the week after Easter. No one gets excited about that. Christmas, everybody gets excited. The lights go up and the music and the rapping and all that stuff happens. But when Christmas is over, you finally take down the lights and you take down your tree and you put your stuff, unless you're our neighbors and you leave it up till summer. But I'm just saying, most people take it down and put it away. The decorations have to go. The holiday is over. And today, the holiday is over. Passover's finished. They've eaten the lamb. They've offered the sacrifice. It's time to go home. And Mary and Joseph get together, and they get all their stuff, and the whole crowd, everybody headed to Nazareth. They're all going together, and they leave the city of Jerusalem, and they make it a whole day's journey before somebody realizes Jesus isn't in the crowd. Now, this is the point when people start saying, why didn't somebody call family services on Mary and Joseph and say, how did you lose your kid for an entire day and not know it? But there's really a number of possibilities, 3 that I think are distinct possibilities. Number 1 is sometimes when they traveled, the men traveled in one section and the women traveled in one section. The guys are talking about their stuff and the ladies are talking about their stuff. And it's very easy in a situation like that for Joseph to expect that Jesus was with Mary and Mary to expect Jesus was with Joseph, right? They just would have assumed he's with his mom or he's with his dad, not knowing until one day had passed that he wasn't with either one of them. The second thing could have been, and it happens a lot of times in church, is friends. You know, kids are always going with friends, and they're going with this friend today, and they're going with that family, and we're just kind of, that's how it goes. In a church family, they kind of go back and forth, and it could have been that Joseph and Mary are traveling, and they said, well, you know what, that family's kids were with us on the way down, and maybe Jesus is with them on the way back, and it's a whole day before they realize that he wasn't. The third possibility is that sometimes the men and women traveled separately, and at least in a little bit of a gap, and the kids might have had their own group, and maybe they would have assumed all day Jesus was with the kids. He was playing with the kids on the journey until they realized he wasn't among his friends. But whatever the case, the journey has come, and it's been a full day before they realize he's not there. And we don't want to be too hard on Mary and Joseph because everybody would have assumed he was in the crowd, but he wasn't there. And they realize that, and so they make a U-turn, and they make another day's journey back. This is 2 of the days. It says 3 days. Now, the one day before they realize it, one day as they journey back, and the third day when they get to the city of Jerusalem, and they begin to look for Jesus. They begin to go to the places they think he might be until they come to the temple and find 12-year-old Jesus sitting there with all of the teachers and the scribes surrounding him, and he's not learning from them. He is teaching and astounding and amazing them. And Jesus says to them, did you not know I had to be about my Father's business? Talking about the Lord's presence tonight, the first thing I want to talk about is the removal of the Lord's presence. Is that when we talk about the Lord's presence, we have to understand there is a general presence of God and a specific presence of God. And what I mean by that is when we talk about the general presence of God, we have a church word that's a big word, omnipresence, right? And we talk about the omnipresence of God, which means all present. God is everywhere always. Do you believe that tonight? That God is on the highest mountain, in the lowest valley, in the farthest galaxy. God is there. God is in Sullivan. He's also in India. He's also in South Korea. He's also in Denmark and Norway. He's all over the world. That's the general presence of God. And yet there is a specific presence of God when God chooses to localize and manifest his presence. In other words, God was all over Israel, and yet he manifested his presence to hover above the Ark of the Covenant as they traveled for 40 years, and then in the tabernacle and the temple. They knew God was everywhere, but they also knew that God was manifest, that he was intensified his presence in that one place. We see that God was everywhere, and yet we see that Jesus said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together. Do you understand that? That I know God is with me when I'm by myself, but something happens when 2 or 3 are gathered together where it's intensified, it's localized, it's manifested. And so that's what I want to talk tonight about, is the fact that you can have the intensified and manifest presence of God and not know it. You can be like Jacob, who ran away from Esau and ran away from his parents, and he's on the run, and he comes to that place called Luz, which means separation, and boy, did that fit him, because he'd never felt so separated in his life. He feels 1,000 miles away from anybody who cares about him, and 10,000 miles away from God, and out there in the middle of nowhere, he takes a stone and he lays down and he sees a ladder that's stretched all the way to heaven, but on the top of that ladder, he sees the Lord, and God reconfirms his covenant, and Jacob gets up. And remember what he said? He said, no longer is this place called Luz. This is no longer the place of separation. I'm going to build an altar. This is Bethel, the house of God, for the Lord was with me, and I did not know it. And sometimes, like Jacob, we find ourselves on the run in our lives. We find ourselves going through things where we feel so separated and so distant, and we wonder, are we by ourselves? And sometimes we don't even realize God is right there. Sometimes that's what happens. Much like Jacob, we don't even know the presence of the Lord is with us because we have got so much going on. Sometimes we're like the disciples who were in the storm that night on the Sea of Galilee, and they think they're going to drown. They think they're going down. They think this is it. And Jesus comes walking across the water, and do you remember what they said? They cried out for it. They thought it was a ghost. They thought he was a ghost walking on the water, and they cried out because of that. And here they were in the very presence of the Son of God and did not recognize it because of the storm. Well, that's also like many of us. We go through storms, and we go through situations where The waters are choppy and the wind is blowing and it's awfully dark in our lives, and sometimes we don't realize the presence of God is there because of the storm, but He was there even in the midst of the storm. I don't know about you, but I'm glad He doesn't leave me just because I go through a storm, but He's there. Sometimes we're like Mary Magdalene, who didn't recognize the presence of God on Easter Sunday morning because of the tears in her eyes. Easter Sunday morning, and she comes to the tomb, and her eyes are so filled with tears. She's talking to a guy she thought was the gardener, but it wasn't the gardener. It was the risen Son of God. And Jesus begins to talk to her, and she's saying, they've taken my Lord, and I don't know where they've taken him. And all of a sudden, He calls her by name, and when she hears Him call her by name, His sheep know His voice, and something hits her, and she responds, and she says, Master, Rabboni, Lord. And all of a sudden, she wipes the tears and sees she's Jesus. But because of the brokenness of her heart, she couldn't see His presence because of the tears in her eyes. Sometimes we find ourselves in the same situation. We've gone through something. We're so brokenhearted. We're so filled with tears in our eyes that we can't see the Lord's presence is there. But how many know the Bible said He is near the brokenhearted, and He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their... He's really never closer to us than when we're broken. And yet, these three instances, people had the presence of the Lord but didn't notice it. But can you also understand tonight, you can lose the presence of God and not notice it as well? There was a guy named Samson, if I remember right, in the book of Judges, right? That great hero, that man who could kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He could rip the gates off and carry them away. He could do incredible exploits when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And Delilah began to talk to him one day, and she said, I want to know the secret. And finally he broke down and he told her the secret. He said, Delilah, my hair's never been cut. He said, if you cut my hair, there goes my power, not because of the hair. Understand, it was not his haircut. That was not the source of his strength. It was the covenant that he made with God. His parents made with God, the Nazirite vow. He would never cut his hair. He would not have anything to do with alcohol. He would not touch a dead body. He would take the Nazirite vow. He'd never, as long as he was walking in a faithful covenant relationship with God, he had the power of God upon him. But he said, Delilah, if that covenant relationship is broken, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, I lose my power. And she lulled him to sleep that night, and she took the scissors and cut off his hair, and she said, here come the Philistines. And the Bible says, and he jumped up thinking he would go out as at other times, not knowing that the Spirit of the Lord had left him. And sometimes I think people, much like Samson, they begin to drift away and falter in their relationship with the Lord, and they're not holding up their end of the bargain anymore. They're not faithfully walking with God and don't even notice that the Spirit of the Lord has begun to slip away from them. So there is the removal of the Lord's presence. But here's the second thing, are the reasons for the removal of the Lord's presence. The reasons they lost Jesus, number one, was because of activity. They were so busy that they forgot to check to see if Jesus was in the crowd. They were so busy checking everything else off their list, they forgot to see if their kids were on the list. They were so busy with the stuff, they stopped focusing on Jesus. Boy, we got to be awfully careful, don't we? We got to be awfully careful. The church at Ephesus, we've been in Revelation on Sunday morning. Jesus said, I know your works and your labor. I know you're busy with all the stuff, but you've left your first love. You're so busy with the stuff that you don't have any time for Jesus. The church at Laodicea, he said, look at all you've got going on, but you don't even realize Jesus is no longer inside the church. He's on the outside knocking, saying, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in. What kind of a church did they have when Jesus lived in the midst of their presence? But all because of activity. If we're not careful, it's very easy for us to get so busy, we end up having so much on our calendar, Jesus is no longer on the calendar. Sometimes activity can do it. Sometimes it can be assumption. Just like Samson, they assumed, or he said, he thought as at other times, it's been this way every other time, surely it'll be that way this time. And sometimes that's what happens. People think, well, I've been a Christian for so many years. I've been walking with the Lord for so many years. Surely the Lord's presence is just as real in my life now as it ever has been, because I've still been going through the same motions, but that's not enough. I want to tell you what, I remember what Moses said back after the golden calf incident. Do you remember that? Moses is up on the mountain, and the Aaron that big party, and they're throwing a party all around, dancing around that calf, worshiping an idol. And Moses gets so mad, and he breaks the 10 Commandments, and he begins to talk to God. And God says in the very next chapter, Exodus 33, he says, Moses, he says, listen, he says, I'm going to let you go ahead and take my children into the promised land because I keep my word. He said, they can have my promises. They can have the promised land. They can have my provision. They can have the land flowing with milk and honey. They can have all the good stuff that's out there. They can even have my protection. I will not allow the enemies to harm them. I will not allow the enemies to hurt them. But here's what God said. But I'm not going. That's what he said. Moses, he said, they can have all the stuff. I'll keep my end of the bargain, but I'm not going with them. And you remember what Moses said? He said, Lord, if you do not go, do not send us, because the stuff does not matter. I want you. The stuff is not enough. I want you. And so Moses said, I'm not going to allow the Spirit of God to slip away because of all this stuff. Here's the third thing we see tonight is the remedy. The Bible says they went seeking him. They wanted him back, and they went to find him. I like what David said after his fall with Bathsheba. He said, Lord, you can take anything else you want, but do not cast me away from thy presence. Do not cast me away from thy. I want your presence more than anything else. They went seeking him because they wanted him. I was trying to remember how long ago it had been, and I don't know. I think probably about 10 years ago, we had gone to Silver Dollar City in the middle of summer, and it was one of those days where there were people everywhere. You could hardly walk because there were so many people there. And our girls were very, very small, and we had them both on backpacks that had the leashes, and that way we could hold on to them in the big crowd. We knew where they were because we had them on a leash that was there. And we're walking along, and all of a sudden we saw a little girl that was maybe 5 or 6 years old. She was just standing there crying. Didn't look like she'd hurt herself, just standing there right in the middle of this crowd, just crying. And so we walked up and we said, honey, what's wrong? And she, through her tears and kind of sobbing, she said, I've lost my dad. I don't know where he's at. I don't know what happened, but I've lost my dad. And we said, okay, it's all right. Don't get upset. You're going to stay with us until we find your dad. We're going to find a park employee. We're going to find security. We're going to find your dad, but you stay with us. And it wasn't long before I could see over the crowd where she couldn't, and I could see quite a while, 30, 40 feet away, there was a man who was just kind of turning circles, looking all around him, and I thought, I wonder if that's him. So when there was a gap in the crowd and she could see, I said, is that your dad right over there? And she said, yes, that's him, that's my dad. And so we went over to him, we took her with us, and as soon as he saw her, he said, there you are. He said, he looked at me and he said, here's what happened. He said, we were just walking along, and he said, I was looking at stuff and not paying attention to her, and he said, and somehow in the crowd, I just drifted one way and she just drifted the other way. We said, well, here she is, and I wanted to say, get a leash like we've got. That won't happen to you, but whatever else, I'm not here to preach to you. So I said, here she is. We gave him back, and we probably walked 20 feet away, and I turned back, and he was doing the same thing, doing like this, and I saw her begin to wander away from him again. And I told Cash, I said, we can't spend all day walking around with this guy, making sure he keeps his daughter. I said, we can't do that. But we pushed her back to her dad again. We said, that's your dad. Hold his hand. Stay with him, But I thought, here was a guy who wasn't really that concerned about it. He figured he'd find her somewhere. He figured somebody would spot her, somebody would bring her back. But he wasn't that desperate to find her. But Mary and Joseph were. They were desperate to find Jesus. And so they went and they found him. And I like what the scripture says. God said through Jeremiah 29, he said, and you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all of your heart. And so when they went back, they found Jesus. He'd never left. He was in the place he was supposed to be, and he was waiting for them. Are you glad tonight that even though people may stray, but he never leaves? He's in the same place with arms open wide saying, come, whosoever will may come, and let him who hears, let him come. He says that's where he's at. He's never left. And he says, but if you drift, if you slip, if you walk away, he says you can come back and you can find him where he's been the whole time and where he's waiting when we seek him with our whole heart. Stand tonight, if you would, as musicians come, and close your eyes for a moment. I don't know that there's anybody here tonight that's drifted away from the Lord. I'm not implying that. All I'm saying tonight is I want more of his presence than I've ever had before in my life. I don't want to assume his presence in my life. I don't want to be so caught up with activities that I let that distract me from the importance of focusing on him. But tonight, Jesus to be the center of our attention. Tonight, him to be the center of our focus. Mary and Joseph certainly weren't bad people. They were just distracted people. They weren't neglectful parents. They were just busy parents. And they forgot to focus on the most important thing. Let us not make the same mistake tonight and let anything take our eyes off of Jesus. But tonight, let us focus upon him and say, I want to be closer to Jesus than I've ever been. He's never left. He's in the same place. He still has arms open wide. He's still saying, come. He's saying, you can get as close to me as you want. You draw near to me, and I will draw near to you. Tonight, I want the manifest presence of God in my life. I want that intensified presence of the Lord in my life. I don't want to be like Samson and wake up in the morning expecting to go out as at other times, not knowing that the Lord had left me. And then some may be here tonight like Jacob or the disciples of Mary Magdalene, and you've got some things going on in your life and you felt like God had abandoned you and forsaken you, but he is with you right now. And I think sometime soon you're going to open your eyes and you're going to say, surely the Lord was with me and I just didn't know it. He never left my side because he promises he wouldn't leave me nor forsake me. As long as I'm walking faithfully with Him, He's going to stick right by me. And even if I have to go through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't have to fear any evil, for He is with me. Could you come tonight and find a place and seek Him with your whole heart? Can you come tonight and find a place to drop on your knees and put your attention on Jesus? Can you come tonight and say, Lord, I want more of your presence. I want a closer walk.